This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Hello, and welcome back to another edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast. I'm Carl Joern, field agronomist in Northwest Indiana and Northeast Illinois for the May 7th edition of the podcast. I'm joined, as always, by my colleagues and co-hosts, Brian Shrader and Ben Jacob, field agronomists from the East and West Central portions of the state. How are you, fellas?
Very good, Carl. Glad to be here this morning.
Doing well, Carl. How are you?
Just dandy. Can't say that I put an exacta bet on the proper pony here coming off of the race for the roses, Kentucky Derby in the rear view. But I'm sure that our starring guest here, Dr. Dan Quinn, Purdue Corn Extension Specialist for the Agronomy Department here in West Lafayette, probably had some good intel going in since he was down in the great state of Kentucky prior to making his way back up here north closer to home. So Dan, welcome back to the podcast. I ask you, did you put the proper bet on the proper pony going into Sunday or Saturday, mind you?
No, I did not. I'm a terrible horse bettor, but do have some experience being down in Kentucky for 3 years. I will say that I always tell folks that Keeneland and Lexington is way better than Churchill Downs in Louisville. So I was
okay.
That, so.
That's right. Little rivalry between the universities that way. Yeah, that was probably my favorite hidden gem in Grand Island when we were out there right out of school. Was they had this little dirt oval racetrack. Fauner Park was the name. So Saturdays in the spring, summertime. For that matter, I think Thursdays and Fridays even, if I remember right. But yeah, had a whole slate of horse races. And so anyway, that aside, Dan, we are pleased to be joined by you at the just in the nick of time. This is usually a big corn planting week in the state of Indiana, especially up my way. But as listeners know all too well, on the other ends of these microphones, sitting a little wet in a lot of parts of the state. What's going through their minds? How can you, I guess, make them feel better about where they may be sitting with respect to corn yield potential? And what's going through your mind as the state's extension specialist for corn?
It's still May 5th, right? I had to reiterate that to myself even last week, April, even around central Indiana up to kind of northwest Indiana, there's quite a few acres that got into the ground over the last week or two. We have about anywhere from 10 to 15 trials in the ground already. And that's, from our perspective, that's about the earliest we've been. But again, it's the big thing is it's still May 5th. You look at the forecast coming up the next 10 days, obviously that could very much change, but it looks pretty promising over the next 10 days. So once folks begin to dry out over the next few days, I expect, full steam ahead across the state upcoming, and still a lot of yield potential out there, right? We always talk about, beginning of May, you might lose, 0.1 to 0.2% per day. And then that, kind of increases as you go through the state, or go through the month, sorry. So end of May, early June, it's when you start, 1% and above per day. At that point in time, you start losing quite a bit of yield once you get into June, but still can achieve really good yields in the month of May, late May. I've planted a lot of corn since I've been in this position on, May 28th, May 29th, June 1st, and got really outstanding yields. It's just, when we talk about losing yield this time of year, it's always potential yield. It's not going to be actual yield. We can't predict what's going to go on the rest of the year. It might be beautiful, perfect. We might get smoked with disease, stuff like that. So, there's still a lot of potential, still a lot of time, right? I know it's frustrating. That's probably the big thing is I take a lot of phone calls this time of year of just kind of, being a little bit of a psychologist, right?
Yes.
For the farmers, but I understand them. We have to do a lot of planting ourselves for our trials, and we get antsy and get upset if we can't get in the field too. So we do understand it.
Dan, is there a way to do a planting date study that legitimately would take out all of those late season effects? I mean, in my mind, when I look at that data, we can see what it says, but we don't typically account for, like you're talking about, the drought, late season, or those kind of things. I get year over year effect, but is there any way that we could actually design a real actual trial for somebody where we could actually show really what planting date by itself actually has an impact? I mean, we work in a business where everything relies on everything. We talk about, the stacking of stresses and everything. Can you design a trial where it would purely measure planting date and take all the rest of the fluff out of it?
That's a really good question. I think it's probably pretty impossible to just isolate, because so many of those factors are part of that equation. So like we've been doing some planting date trials last couple years now. So got one planting date in this year, and often what we find, right, is, with a little bit, we'll see it on both ends of the spectrum with corn. Sometimes the earlier planted stuff, one thing we noticed last year with our planting date trials, actually the earliest planted stuff did not out yield the early May stuff, and largely came back to disease and also when certain stresses occurred. So we had some dry conditions come in last year. That corn was much more progressed at that point in time, and it was a little bit more sensitive. Same with some of the diseases. We had tar spot come in, and it was hitting that crop a little bit more advanced stage at that point in time. So it may have impacted it then, but I'd say it's probably largely the dry conditions that impacted it. The earlier planted corn last year was actually probably, I would say a foot shorter in terms of the overall growth. You think about when drought conditions come in and it's during that rapid growth phase, it's gonna kind of hinder that overall factory of that plant a little bit. But yeah, the challenge with planting date, right, is often those dates. What really is going to impact it is what the additional stuff later in the season and when is it occurring in that plant's life cycle. So sometimes earlier planting, heck, that's great. We might, earlier planting, they might tassel, a lot sooner. It might be much better conditions, better soil moisture when it tassels. Other years, it might hit it right when it's, really dry and really troublesome. So, that's a really good question, but probably really, really difficult to try and isolate when you're in a field environment, just because a lot of those different factors kind of factor in the equation of why we see the pretty dramatic differences in yields year in and year out with the different planting dates, and why some years you can get away with it, some years you can't. So that's the beauty of agriculture and the highly variable environment that we have to deal with.
Well, speaking of that variable environment, Dan, I'm curious your thoughts. You're evaluating a stand after corn's emerged here, and you're getting anywhere from 12,000, 24,000, and your target of 30. Maybe you planted in at 36, and you're hitting 32 or 33, and you're satisfied. What's Dr. Quinn's replant corn threshold, if you will? I'm asking loaded question here for the listeners, because a lot of what the industry is leaning on right now is work that would have done before, right around the time that Dan would have entered this world. So it's somewhat dated, and what we have from planter technology, which Dan is leading the charge in terms of exploration from an extension standpoint, today's hybrids, ideal populations, all of these things have really changed in 30 years time. What's your assessment? And I'd be interested in terms of where Ben and Brian land on the backside here.
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I talk, typically what my starting point, right, is often 70-75% of targeted stand.
Yes. Okay.
If I'm looking at 32,000, targeted seeding rate of 32 to 34,000, if I'm getting, stand, where we start seeing that yield start to really drop off when you get below that 26 to 25,000 plant stand, then it really kind of tapers from there. But what's interesting now is there's been a lot of work, as you all probably know. They've done a ton of it on, Pioneer's done a ton of this work, Bayer's done a ton of this work where they've evaluated hybrids over time and looked at these era studies. And really interesting piece that we found, and something that we've been documenting in our own research, is that corn does well at high populations, but it actually tolerates low populations much better today than it used to. So when you look at a lot of the seeding rate or plant population trials, when you look at hybrids today versus hybrids in the past, is that optimum plant population, that agronomic optimum plant population, that window or that range is much wider today than what it used to be. So looking at a replant threshold 30 years ago is I think we're a little bit more lenient on that today. And that's just a testament of the genetics and the way that the hybrids can adapt. They just adapt a lot more than they used to. They have a little bit more flexibility. Now, corn is not like soybeans, right? Soybeans, you can get away with, 50% loss and your plant stand and still be okay. Corn is, you still got to be careful of it. But yeah, I kind of start at that, 70 to 75% of that targeted stand, and then kind of play it from there based on the conditions. Another important piece to look at with corn too, not just in terms of stand loss, but also the uniformity of the stand. So just because you have a stand count, but a plant is, 1-2 growth stages behind, you got to pay attention to that too. So if you have, often we look at, 2 growth stages behind, but even a growth stage behind its neighbor, that plant is not going to perform as well. So not only looking at, stand loss, but I'm also looking for uniformity and looking at, is there plants that it's up, but it's, well behind? Well, that plant's probably not going to make it. So you might as well throw that out. So there's a lot of different aspects, especially from the corn side, that's a little bit, you got to pay a little bit more attention, or a lot more attention to corn than you do soybeans.
Perfect. Ryan, Ben, anything to add there in terms of how you're, critically evaluating corn stands on the front end of this crop that might be peeking out of the ground?
Yeah, so I'll say 2 things. One, I'm completely in agreement with Dan on the uniformity. I probably look at that as much or more than I do the actual population number, because in my part of the world, with as many soil type variations as we have, you can have parts of the field that are perfect and you can have parts of the field that are a complete disaster. That leads into the second thing that I will say, is that as equipment has gotten larger, growers have gotten larger, and efficiency is the name of the game. The idea of going in and spot planting for replant, those numbers of growers that are willing to do that today compared to what it was when I started my career 25 years ago is much, much lower. And so when we go into a field, it's not unless it's minimal, it's not a spot in, is this worthy of destruction and start over? Yep. And that frankly changes. And then the other piece that I'll add in kind of as a third point is that, what do they say? Your mileage will vary. There are growers out there that their tolerance for replant and for a lousy or less than maximum stand is much lower than somebody else. And so we can give you guidelines. Dan, 75%. I love that. I had never thought about it in terms of percentages. I've used that chart you referenced my entire career. I was introduced to it as a freshman at Purdue University by Dr. Jim Vorst, and I've never looked back in 25 years. I've used that chart my entire career, and it's always seemed to work out. But today, the tolerance for a cruddy stand is much lower than it was even 10 years ago. And so it's much more destruction and uniformity than it is even a population number at this point, Carl, at least on the eastern side of the state. I'll say it that way.
Yep. Yeah,
I would agree with the uniformity comment, Brian. Sorry, Dan. But the other comment that I would make is that I think if you have a really good understanding of the breadth of your genetics, that comes into play as well. If I look at our lineup right now, most products have decent flex, but understanding the potential of an individual product to flex up and compensate for some of that stand loss can come in too, if we're really nitpicking the stand. But to your point about the size of equipment, man, when we're down here farming the sloughs and everything, I hate replant decisions, and they're some of the worst, because if I get the call to come do it, it's not going to be anything that's straightforward.
Right.
It's like,
Yep.
do we leave it? Do we, it's nothing obvious. So they are difficult. I like the 75% number, but man, it's hard to apply across a whole field with some of the ground that we have down here. But I do think that uniformity is key. And I think that too, I think that's part of the planning date discussion as well. Oftentimes, I think if we track back with the caveat that the 100 days after corn gets planted is much more important than what's happened before that or a date on a calendar. But the corn that seems to perform the best, most consistently, regardless of what the environment throws at it, is that comes out of the ground uniform and has a strong stand and a strong start from the very beginning. Some of this stuff that lays in the ground for 3 weeks, sometimes it turns out fine too, but man, it can be hard to look at for a while. And it just seems that if you have a good uniform stand from day one, your potential is better from the very beginning.
Yeah, corn is a finicky beast, as I say. It doesn't like interference. It likes coming out the same way, and Ben's, right on in that aspect that, a lot of times not the first planting date, but just the second planting date, still capturing that earlier May window there. But typically your soil temps are a lot better. Soil conditions may be a little bit better, but a big piece is soil temperature. We're chasing that 115, 120 growing degree days to get that crop out of the ground. If I plant April 15th, it might take 2 weeks. If I plant, May 5th, it might take, 1 week, right? And then in many cases, you won't see much of a difference between those two crops. But yeah, the last year, we're still doing some work this year. We've been collaborating with Ohio State a little bit to look at, the planting corn and soybeans on the same day at the same time. But not just our data, but a lot of other data is kind of find that second planting date of corn tends to be a little bit better than the first one in terms of if you're targeting like a mid-April versus say an early May. Where soybeans, right? Soybeans, we see this year in and year out that soybeans perform a lot better with those earlier planting dates. You see that across the state, just a really big shift in terms of planting dates and planting soybeans first. Another interesting aspect we found too is in trying to find a way to try and document this a little bit better. But as you track planting dates, another interesting thing when you compare the two crops is that soybeans perform very well at those early planting dates, but they're relatively more stable as those days progress. So we're trying to figure out, I do think there's a point in time where if you're balancing the two crops, right, that you reach a point in May, mid-May, often you need to think about switching to corn, because typically that yield drop off is a lot more drastic in corn when you get to the late April or the late Mays and then the early Junes. You see a lot more of a steeper drop off in terms of overall yield, where soybeans they do lose yield, but they tend to be a little bit more stable over time.
Well characterized. Dan, I'm curious, you're talking about kind of evaluating corn performance based on that planting date, and there being, kind of that curve, maybe a little bit of a detriment if we're too early, and then there's a peak and then it falls off. Have we ever tried to correlate that to days to emergence? Because I could see there being something on the front end there, and then like you said, now we're getting to an untimely planting, but that is a way that some farmers look at it of, well, I don't want my corn to sit in the ground for 2-3 weeks. What's the incentive there? I can get across my acres if I have 7 good days of planting in the spring. What are your thoughts on what's too long to sit in the ground? Is there such a thing as too long to sit in the ground in terms of attaining maximum yield?
Yeah, I typically, the first thing I attribute it to sitting in the ground a long time is really the performance of the seed treatments. They only buy you a certain amount of time. I forget, maybe 20, 30 days off of seed treatment. So, you get past that 3 week, mark, I start getting worried about those really the seed treatment aspect. And then, are we having, because if it's taking that long, right, that seed is sitting in ground that is cold, right, and in many cases moist. So I really start getting a little concerned about seedling diseases at that point in time. That's a big thing that we find. And also, kind of back to that uniformity aspect too, the longer it sits, the more you're probably going to have issues with uniformity when you think about the variation across fields today, and variation in residue levels and all these aspects too. So but yeah, often the first piece I look at is just how long is that seed treatment going to hold on at the early season, because I have seen corn plants really look really bad after seedling disease finds its way in.
Fair enough. What would you say the most common mistake is folks make early in the goings of planting? Naturally, we're going to be coming across this episode here on the front end of May, but what do you think you get visits on that it's a common refrain that could be easily avoided by many Indiana corn farmer?
Yeah, I think the top two. There's probably two since I've been in this position that I've gotten the most calls on, and I typically get them every year. Is one, planting too wet, right? That's year in and year out. That's, I don't know how many times where I've had a farmer call and say, my corn looks like crap, or
you know what? Yep.
much more colorful language than that. And then you stick a shovel into the ground and dig one plant. I had a farmer, I walked out into his field, and he was asking me questions, but I had a pretty good idea of what happened. But dug one plant, held the plant up to him with the roots, and he took one look and went, "Oh yeah, probably should have waited." Right. So that's a big one, year in and year out. But it makes sense, right? People get impatient. You try to push it a little bit. You don't want to wait another day when it gets wet. So it's understandable why it happens. Another big one has been fertilizer burn. That's one I've seen probably every year since I've been in this position. Whether it be in furrow, pop-up fertilizers getting too hot on folks, 2x2, anhydrous. I've had a lot of issues with, anhydrous, where, they plant above the row, and, row cleaners were too aggressive. And then you confound that with being a little bit deeper, and they're a little bit closer to that anhydrous band. And, you had dry conditions. We've had some dry springs the last couple of years that tends to kind of exacerbate some of these issues with fertility. So root burn, but big piece of these two big issues, right, is they really come back to the root health of corn. When corn is young, I reiterate this point every year. The root health is just so important. If that first root gets out of that seed, that radical root merges into an environment that it does not like, that plant may be stunted or even die, and it's just set up for failure the rest of the year. You add in planting too wet, or having your planter not set properly, or stuff like that. You can we always talk about sidewall compaction, right? That's 1 year in and year out that I see just really restricts that root development and that root growth. And that's just stuff that just is going to follow you the rest of the year in terms of nutrient deficiencies. Drought tolerance is going to be poorer. Lodging is going to be higher. It's just, year in and year out, that root establishment, right? Not only just getting the plant out of the ground uniformly and quickly, but getting that root system established, right? Where it transitions its root system and starts, kind of occupying that area and starting to grow, and not being restricted is really, really important this time of year. So I always, one of the first things I always look at when I get a call that stuff looks like, is I'm digging up those roots and taking a look at the roots, because it seems like 9 times out of 10 you find your problem when you do that.
Interesting. I'm curious, as folks are evaluating maybe those earliest planted stands here. Maybe they accidentally got in when 80% of the field was fit, but there was 20% on the bottom that was a little tacky yet. Naturally got sidewall compaction, smearing, things of that nature. You could also have, subcompacted layer if we work the ground a little bit early. As they're looking at that emerging corn seedling itself, when do you know if you got, if the planter rode up over a ridge and you planted too shallow? How can you kind of help folks diagnose here and in an audio format? Recognize that visually this is an easier conversation with an infield demo, but how does the corn plant look different, Dan, if you planted it at an inch when it's supposed to be closer to 2?
It just, looks more stressed, right? A lot of it's a lot smaller. The big tell a lot of times is nutrient deficiencies start to show up real early in the crop. But another piece too is just, in terms of diagnosis, right? Look at the furrow as you one of the telltale signs of sidewall compaction is that furrow's still staying open as that planter goes through those areas. But yeah, corn, it just gets that sickly off green look. We always talk about corn, and a big piece about corn, right, is when it's young, up until V2, V3, it largely lives off the seed. So, sometimes it emerges, it might come out of the ground and say, hey, it's looking great. And then, 2 weeks later, you're like, oh man, what happened at that point in time? But that's, that corn plant's, kind of weaning itself off the seed. And then it says, hey, I need to rely on my root system. And if my root system's constricted and poor, then that plant just kind of reflects that, right? We see a lot of nutrient deficiencies pop up real early. You see just a more sickly plant, off green, not as big, not as healthy, right? You usually can tell pretty quick. And then, looking at that furrow, digging those plants, you can tell pretty quick just by looking at the roots.
Very good. I want to throw one to Ben here. We were talking before the podcast got going about how much rain we're sitting on, planting progress, things of that nature. Ben, have you had any conversations this year about ponding in corn, whether they're seeds or seedlings, things of that nature? Or would you have a question on behalf of your growers for Dr. Quinn in that department?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, I guess I'd say thankfully in this situation, maybe not. Carl, we have so little planted that those conversations have not come up this
Very
year.
good.
But there's still plenty of time for that. And so yeah, I would love some feedback from Dr. Quinn on that. It seems to me that, as long as we're staying cool, and we have a lot of river bottom ground that's going to get out, and, it has got out. The river bottoms you plant when you can get to them. So some of them actually did get planted back in March. And then, had a foot of water on them for a few days. And I'm always amazed in those situations how much of the crop is left. And it seems from what I can read and firsthand experience that a lot of that's driven by temperature, obviously the time component, how many days, but my simple explanation for it to growers is that hot and wet is terrible, cold and wet's bad. Okay, when it comes to complete stand loss. Now time comes into that, but Dan, I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. If it's warm and ponding, that is much worse than cool. Ponding is bad across the board, right? But cooler temperatures can help, and it largely just is a function of the oxygen depletion out of that environment. So you have much more rapid oxygen depletion when you have higher temperatures at that point in time. You're gonna meet those more anoxic conditions much quicker, and that's really that time period when that occurs. That's when you look at 24 hours, 48 hours after that, that's when we start having issues in corn, especially when it's at the seedling stage, right? When the seeds below the ground, it's living off the seed, but also when the growing point's below the ground, it's just going to be a lot more susceptible to flooding at that point in time. Corn gets a little bit bigger, it's going to become more tolerant to flooding. Still not ideal, but when you have those higher temperatures, it's just going to cause us to lose that oxygen in the environment much quicker, and then kind of speed up the process of killing those corn plants, which we don't want. Another big thing that we see with flooding is just denitrification. As well, tend to lose a lot of nitrogen through denitrification when we have a lot of ponding. So that's, talk about replant being a tricky question. That's the other question I hate, is how much nitrogen I lose and how much do I need to apply? Because it's a really complicated one. We can try and walk you through the steps and try and get you close, but it's often pretty challenging. And another thing I always recommend with when you have those type of conditions is easier said than done. Try and be a little bit patient and give that crop some time to understand, is it recovering or is it not recovering, right? I always am amazed kind of how resilient these young plants can be in certain cases, whether it be hail or flooding or stuff like that. But just giving it some time, in terms of letting that flooding subside, letting those temperatures maybe warm up a little bit. You might be shocked, right, in terms of seeing that crop kind of pick up as well. But that's a big piece, right? Denitrification, flooding is also going to restrict your roots, right? You're going to have, much smaller of a root system too that could potentially impact you later in the season. But yeah, it's not something we want this time of year.
Good deal. We hit the nail on the head in terms of Dan's pedigree, looking at some pioneer literature sourcing. Chad Lee down at Kentucky on both fronts, nitrogen conversion and saturated conditions, in addition to that flooded corn seedling and how long she'll last. So that right there in the thick of it. Dan, speaking of research, other places, you would have just published your 2024 findings here over the winter time. Anything that you'd like to convey to growers that maybe haven't sat down with your publication here that you could do it justice in an audio format today?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm trying to think of some major highlights, right? We have such diverse research trials across the board. I think a big piece that we found is, and this is every single year we deal with this, is just, I would say, in many cases, both the diversity and the inconsistency of responses from a lot of these trials. But what I'm getting at with that is that, understanding what works on your own farm and your own fields is really, really imperative, because the more trials I do around the state of Indiana from all of these diverse conditions, and what we find is that many of these, you'd be really hard pressed to find something that works year in and year out across all of those locations, right? We see, we always call them blips, right? We'll see a little bit here, nothing here, a little bit there, nothing there. And we see a lot of hybrid differences too. I think, a big piece that I've tried to dive into a lot more is just trying to understand hybrid interactions, because hybrids are so different in the way they can respond to just a simple management practice in the same field. An example of this is, we've done a little bit just looking at depth of seed and found hybrid interactions with depth of seed. So, a lot of that's pretty preliminary, and we're trying to dive into a lot of those hybrid interactions with different management aspects a lot more. You bring in, fixed and flex sears. We're trying to do more of that. And but it really comes back to when you look at, the testing we do and the trials, is that understanding what your environment, your fields, your hybrids, understand, working with you all, right? I'm always a big proponent on working with your seed folks and understanding your hybrids and how they perform and where they're placed. I don't have time to follow you, understand you all's hybrids. So I just call Carl instead and ask questions. So, but that's really key, right? Is proper hybrid placement and the way it responds, but also understanding your environment and the challenges you have year in and year out, and then tailoring your management to address those challenges is really key. You might have tar spot real bad. Other areas we haven't had tar spot as bad. Or, you talk about nutrients and ponding issues and all these aspects. We're doing a lot of inhibitor work recently. The areas of sandier soils, right, where we have when we have end loss conditions, those inhibitors do what they're supposed to. But it's a little bit more challenging in, Tippecanoe County and West Lafayette, well-drained topsoil to get those responses. So, so understanding, when you look at those reports, right, it's just kind of hey, is there some trials that are maybe close to my area, and how do they perform, and understand it that way? Because just because I see something in West Lafayette does not mean it's going to perform over in Bryan's area of the state as well. So, try and understand what works and what doesn't, but also take into account where it was done, what were the conditions when it was done, stuff like that, and understand, hey, is there some similarities between what they found in their environment versus what I deal with in my own environment. That's really, really key.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it, unless Brian, Ben, you had any parting shots. But I think what I heard from Dan was, you've really got, it's important to understand your ground, how to farm it, and work with those folks that know the inputs that you're going to be, putting into your own individual experiment that varies from year to year. There's very few common variables across your operation. But Ben, any parting words or questions for today?
Yeah, Dan, just as a follow-on to that, I mean, your reflection on 24, you said you have a number of trials already in the ground this year. What are you excited about in 25?
I think, some of this is, is really expanding on these hybrid interactions. We've got some, really trials that layer in a lot of really different management practices, but have very diverse hybrids in them. A couple of examples, right? We have kind of some, I've done a lot of intensive management, and that's something that, we always try to do, but we're trying to layer in a lot more hybrid diversity into those trials in terms of, flex versus fixed. I've been doing, a lot of short stature corn work. That's another big piece that's coming down the pipeline. So really diving into these yield components and understanding the interactions of kernel number and kernel weight, and how they perform with one hybrid versus the other, and how you can maybe push the needle with one hybrid and the other in different ways. Another big trial that we're doing too is, looking at harvest timing, right? That's a big question that we have. Myself and Darcy Telenko are doing a lot of mycotoxin work now, because that's become more and more of an issue in the state of Indiana, and it's really being impacted from both the feed and the ethanol process as well. So Ohio's dealt with it pretty bad. Michigan's pretty bad, but you get into eastern, northeast Indiana, it's getting worse and worse. But looking at really diverse hybrids and diverse hybrid characteristics, and how that impacts ear rots, but bringing in the aspect of harvest timing too. That's a phantom yield loss is a question I get every single year, but we're doing a lot more intensive approach and trying to understand kernel development and kernel qualities and parameters as we get later and later, but having really diverse hybrids as well, to try and get different ends of the spectrum. So yeah, I get really interested and excited in kind of these layered approaches trials that integrate kind of a holistic view in terms of management and genetics. We can always do a yes/no fungicide trial, or a seeding rate trial, or a nitrogen rate trial, and we always do those, and we always have to do those. But when you look at advancing the system, you have kind of layer that in and take that holistic approach and really dive into the physiological aspects of those hybrids, and how they perform and how they may not perform. So that's kind of what's got me excited, is just the diversity of hybrids, and then how do we tailor management to maybe push or yield those different diverse hybrids a little bit better, or manage them a little bit better. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Very good. Well, Dan, want to thank you again for your time this morning. Folks wanted to follow along with your work. I know that they can check out the kernel.info if memory serves. And then how about on the socials, as you keep folks up to date with trial progress and things of that nature?
Yeah, Purdue Corn on I guess it's X now, Twitter X, Purdue Corn. But the kernel.info is my website. We've been trying to put a lot of work into that recently. So my research book is on there, so a digital copy. But one thing we added this last year is actually, if you just It's right on the homepage. You can actually request physical copies. So we do get these books printed. There's a link on there that if you want one, it's free. So we can get them printed. Indiana Corn Marketing Council supports this. So we get a bunch printed. If you request one, it goes right to our extension coordinator, and she'll ship them out that day. So we've had people request 30 of them. We've had, farmers that request 2-3 of them. So I encourage that. We're just trying to get more mileage out of, sharing what we find. A lot of these are, quick summaries on yield, yield differences and stuff like that. But so use that. We have been trying to ramp up more of a weekly newsletter too, and then you can access that and find it on the website and how to get that too, just in terms of trying to aggregate a lot of the corn information from climate aspects to weed science to disease to things we're doing, planting progress, crop conditions, stuff like that. So if you're more than welcome to send me a note, social media, email, access the website, try and sign up for some of that stuff. We do it just to share information, and we always appreciate more people just being a part of it. So, yeah.
Absolutely. No, good stuff, Dan. Well, thanks for being on with another edition of our Checking Up with the Doc series with Dr. Dan Quinn of Purdue University. With that, Brian, we'll be signing off today. Where might folks follow along with you and your work there in North Indiana?
Yep, you can always get a hold of me by my Pioneer email, brian.shrader@pioneer.com, or you can occasionally find me on Instagram at B_K_Shrader. And Ben, how about you?
Yep, you can occasionally find me on X at the Ben Jacob, and a little bit more frequently on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy. Carl, how about you?
Same places. That would be on Facebook at Joern Agronomy and on X at Joern. So with that, we look forward to hearing more from you in terms of planting progress, any challenges that you're facing, any management opportunities down the road. And until next time, we will talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.